listening to this on the podcast, what you'll see, definitely not what you'll see, what you'll hear is me talking through today the idea of the arch and how I integrate that with my athletes. And some of you may have heard me talking about the arch, some of you definitely haven't. But this is the only way that I approach the mental approach to training with any of my athletes. Like, I personally use it. The athletes that I use who, for example, are going to the CrossFit Games, or who are very high level fighters, or who are tactical athletes, all of these, and let me just say that as well, that's the elite end as well. Every athlete who I train who is a much more foundational level of training and doesn't have the same goals, so he has more goals around health, wealth, health and happiness, I think is the way to put it. Everyone who has those kind of goals too uses this, because it's an approach that scales to everyone's need. It's an approach that works whatever your desired outcome. So just to put it out there, I use this for every kind of athlete that I train. The one core thing to discuss and to identify before we get started with this is the fact that unless we have identified beliefs, unless we have a real solid foundation of mindset, there's next to no reason to start working on this, because we'll just default into the patterns which don't help us. So we have to have that foundation first of understanding our beliefs, that self-knowledge, that manipulation of our beliefs before we get moving with this. The reason this came about is due to the amount of confusion there is. Like, in the CrossFit Games, there's so much that the CrossFit Games, in CrossFit and functional fitness in general, there's so much variety in WODs. And excuse me whilst I have a sip of coffee. There's so much variety in WODs, and there's so much variety in performance, and there's so much variety in the individual athletes. So I needed to create an approach that worked no matter your skill level, no matter the WOD, no matter your current ability. And this is what I came about, and it's presented in arch. And let me just clarify that in one small way as well. Like, this is a one size fits one approach. Yes, these are principles that apply. These are principles that apply to everyone, and we can take the principles, but you need to remember to adapt them to your individual need, to your individual desired outcome. So look for the principles here, not the exact what. Look for the why and the who over the what. So one size fits one. This is presented in the concept of an arch, and Julian and Richard and Greg at StrongFit, they've done a fantastic job promoting the concept of an arch. But for you guys listening on the podcast, if you can imagine just that shape of an arch, like an arch of a bridge, or the top of some doors, like the old school doors, that kind of thing. You can imagine that top arch, and this arch, and I'm going to draw it on the board for the guys that are live streaming this in my Facebook group. You can imagine an arch being this kind of shape. And what we see here is this arch is the strongest shape in nature as long as the weight is distributed straight down the middle here. If it's to either side, the arch becomes weaker. If it's right down at the bottom and we're pushing in from one side, the arch again is even weaker than that still. So we need to what's called balance the arch. We need to make sure the weight and the pressure and the tension is appropriate. Otherwise, it's a very weak structure. The way this translates to CrossFit or functional fitness, I really need to stop saying that. The way this translates to CrossFit, said it again. The way this translates to functional fitness, there we go, is that on one side of the arch, we can put activities like throwing a sandbag and very explosive low skill activities, I always use it as throwing a sandbag because I think that's the best example there. I used to use power cleans and power snatches, but there's even less skillful activity, or those activities require quite a lot of skill. So as I drop my pen, on this side, on the far left side of the arch, we have things like the power of throwing the sandbag, that kind of thing. On the other side of the arch, we have very static activities or much lower power output. And on the extreme of this in life would be something like Kundalini yoga. There we go. On the functional arch that I call it, this would essentially go to a 10k run. And whilst a 10k run is by no means static, the power output per second is much, much lower. So, how do we actually create our mental approach to the WOD? What we need to do is first understand where our activity fits in that WOD. And for you guys that are watching on the Facebook live stream, this is going to be easier for you to assess because I'll be drawing up on the board. For you guys that are podcasting, it's worth joining my Facebook group so you can see this. So if you search on Facebook for Mindset for Functional Athletes, and there's a dash and then Mindset RX, or if you search for Mindset RX, I'm sure you'll see it. You'll be able to assess this. You'll be able to ask questions, and for you guys who are live streaming as well, feel free to ask questions whenever you want, and I should be able to see them pop up as I go through this. Anyway, first step is to place the WOD on this arch, and the way we do this, there's a variety of different categories that we use to assess where this WOD goes. And initially this seems super convoluted, and it seems like it's a long process to go through, but once you use the system enough times, it becomes almost intuitive. You know roughly where to put each section and each WOD and each movement, and you become able, like, it's just like learning to squat for the first time. When you first learn to squat, it's very shaky, and you see your knees caving in. There's all kind of faults, and it takes time. You have to be very conscious and aware of it, and then you do this enough and you become unconscious. It becomes fluid. You don't have to think about it as much. It's exactly the same with this WOD and with this arch. You use it enough times, you can become absolutely fluid with it. So the first thing we need to do is, on one side of the arch, we have very low skill. I'm going to put LS for the guys that are live streaming, low skill activities. And this is where my board falls over, obviously. So low skill. We have skill, have movements like this. Like, that's why throwing the sandbag is on this side, because yes, there's some technique to it. You can't just move anywhere you want, but it is generally a very explosive activity where you just explode up. So you have low skill on one side, on the left-hand side, and high skill on the right-hand side. The next thing we do is look how much weight bearing there is on you. So, for example, carrying a yoke, that is a lot of weight bearing on you. Whereas you look at, I don't know, let's go for a jump, that'd be just like a box jump, a max effort box jump on the other side. So we have low weight bearing on the left hand side and high weight bearing on the right hand side. And everyone who's live streaming, you'll excuse my scratchy, scrawly writing. Then we look at the power output. And I think about this as power output per unit of time. So power output per second, power output per minute. That's what we're looking at. So per second is generally a good way to look at it. So this is why a snatch is further over onto the left hand side, because any activity with a high power output, God, my writing is awful to say, goes on the left hand side, whereas the low power output goes on the right hand side. And we build this up. The next point is a big point, and that's familiarity. High familiarity goes on the left, low familiarity goes on the right. So the more familiar you are with the environment that you're training in, the more familiar you are with the activity and the movement that you're performing in, even the climate that you're in, even like clothes you're wearing, the people around you, the social structure, you can talk about social inhibition versus social facilitation. All of this familiarity is what feeds into it. So high familiarity on the left-hand side and low familiarity on the right-hand side. Then we look at, again, the second shout out to Julian and Richard and Greg at StrongFit. We look at the external torque chain and internal torque chain. And for you guys who don't know this, like just follow Strong Fit and read their stuff, because it's really important that you know that anyway. But external torque and internal torque, for you guys that do know that, that's going to be understandable straight away. So we have external on one side, internal on the other side. Next we have eccentric loading. And by eccentric loading, we have, like, eccentric is basically for the lowering phase of the squat, or the lowering phase of the movement, where the muscle lengthens under tension. And again, like, this is a slightly technical term, but once you understand it, it's very easy to implement this. So we have very low eccentric loading on one side and high eccentric loading on the other side. So if you think about, let's go for a marathon run, there's a lot of eccentric loading in that, okay, because you're having to brace and slow yourself down effectively on every step, especially if you're running ineffectively. Whereas if we look at that again, that sandbag exploding up, or a power snatch, there's no eccentric loading there, or minimal eccentric loading there. Next is something I left out of this for a long time, and I just realized that you guys, you can just about see. You guys live streaming are kind of screwed a bit. I'll hold it up. There we go. On the next thing is something that I left out for of this arch for a long time, and that's the stakes at play. Say, like, I used a ridiculous example in the blog post I wrote about this, which you can see at mindsetrx.com/blog/thearch. If you go to that, you can see a blog about this. But I use a ridiculous example of, imagine you've got someone like a dictator, or, well, this is controversial, a dictator like Putin, who's forced you to go into this, and you've got a high threat, or your life is at stake. And if you have very high stakes, you'll go on the left-hand side. If you've got very low stakes, so you've got nothing at risk, you're just pissing around with some friends, you're just chilling out, you're learning new skills, and like, there's no time there, like, you'll put the point on the left hand side. And then your ability as well massively adds into this. So if you've got very high ability, it goes on the left hand side, and low ability on the right hand side. So we can begin to build out where this WOD works, or where this WOD fits, or this event fits. And we're just going to use a single movement in an event, but but you can add to this as well. And the thing that I forgot to mention about ability there is that your ability obviously deteriorates with time and deteriorates with fatigue. And if you're, for example, let's say dehydrated, or you haven't eaten properly, that will change things up as well. So high ability, low ability. And then all we do is we plot an average point on the arch. So if we go for, let's take Fran, because Fran is something that we all know. And Fran is something that I am highly familiar with. And I'm going to use myself because it's an easy example. Let's take Fran. We've got a low skill versus high skill. For me, I'll be butterflying the pull-ups, so that's some skill, but I've done a lot of butterfly pull-ups, so that's it's not like I was doing, for example, it's not as technical as muscle ups, it's not as technical as some more complex gym work that I could be doing, it's not as technical as, for example, me doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a movement that I'm vaguely familiar with. And then thrusters, I've done thrusters for almost a decade now, so I'll place that at about, for you guys who are just listening, I'm placing that around 25% of the way, maybe 20% of the way across. So or a better way of putting this is about 30 degrees from the far left hand side of the arch. Then the weight bearing side of it, for me, there's little weight bearing on the pull-ups. Obviously you've got a tiny bit. Then you've got the 42.5 or 43 kilo 42 kilo thrusters. So again, with my one max clean jerk 125, that's not that high. So it's about 45 degrees maybe from the center of the arch. Power output. The power output's going to be fairly high, so it's going to go in the middle. Okay. Then we've got familiarity. Let me start again. The power output is further over again in the middle of those 2 points, and then we just build these points out. So we've got high familiarity. For me, super familiar We've got external torque versus internal torque. That's going to go bang in the middle because we transition as we go through this. Then we've got eccentric loading, again, right in the middle. And what we do is we just plot these points all over the arch. And eventually, what we're left with is an average point across this arch, which usually will go, for me and Fran, at about 45 degrees in. And for you guys listening as well, like, this is a slightly difficult thing to visualize, especially if you're doing something else at the same time. But just if you join the Facebook group, you'll be able to see this easily. And if you've got a super visual mind, then obviously you'll be able to crush this. But we've created an average point of pressure on this arch. And this is where the arch comes into its own. Because all we have to do now is, if you imagine that was actual pressure on an actual arch, we'd brace up against it. And we'd push against it nice and hard and force it out. Okay, and this would imagine the weight going on an arch, and you'd like have a wooden block or a wooden a big brace to push out against that pressure point in the arch. And this brace is your self torque. This is the the malleable controllables that you can create. And we have a few examples of this. So the further a event is, or a movement is, to the left hand side of this WOD, the more we're going to approach it as a macro goal. And by a macro goal, I mean you're focusing on completing the movement as an absolute whole. So you're not thinking about, I'm going to break this down. Let's talk about throwing a sandbag over your shoulder, or a power snatch. A power snatch is a great example. If you're power snatching, going for a single heavy attempt, I don't want you thinking about first pull, second pull, third pull, explode under the bar, pull under, and punch through the bar. I want you thinking about snatching that bar, especially if you're a very familiar athlete with the power snatch. If you're more of a beginner with it, obviously we're gonna tame that down a bit because the familiarity isn't as high. So we take that to the other end as well. We start thinking about a marathon. We start thinking about 10K run, 10K row, something like that. I don't want you thinking of, imagine setting off for a marathon, and you got 26.2 miles to begin with, and then you take a step and you're like, oh, good, I need 26.19999 miles left. It's just overwhelming. So you would break that down into micro goals. So the further the left-hand side is, the more we focus on a macro goal, so 1 rep, and then the further onto the right-hand side it goes, the more we focus on micro goals. And I generally break this down to sets of 10. Then we have aggression versus passivity. So aggression is in the French word agir, to take action forcefully. Aggression is in anger. Anger is blind. Aggression is directed. Aggression is forceful, directed action. Then on the other side we have passivity. So the further to the left hand side of the arch the event sits, the more assertive and aggressive we are. The further over to the right hand side, the more passive we are. I look at this like maternal versus paternal parenting skills. Then we have forgiving versus unforgiving. And this is an interesting thing as well. If an event is far on the left hand side, you don't have time, and you don't have the ability and the freedom to be forgiving to yourself. If it's far on the right hand side, we can be as forgiving as we want because we've got time to make things up, and we don't have to stress out about things. We've got what's 3 steps over the course of a marathon, for example. So if we are super aggressive, if we're super far on the left-hand side, then we can be nice and unforgiving with ourselves. We can be forceful. We can tell ourselves to stop taking that shit and do something. And then if we're far on the right-hand side, it's like, okay, that's fine. This happened. You screwed up a bit, but don't worry about it. And then on the left-hand side, and then the last point, the last malleable controllable that we have is the assertiveness versus association versus disassociation. So association, how much you're involved in the movement, how much you're thinking about so if we're again snatching, I don't want you to think about something you're doing outside of this. I want you to think about just snatching that barbell. If you are performing let's go for the marathon again because it's a nice easy example. people describe this as moving meditation. You might be thinking about slightly different stuff. You might be almost in a meditative state. You might be disassociated from the movement. So once you understand this, and this is getting quite deep into this, but I think it's a lot of you will benefit from this, we can start to develop a phrase book that sits in these certain areas. So a phrase book for me is also the imagery. It's also the is obviously the self-talk, the imagery, the feeling that you can cultivate, and it's ways to fit into this arch. And I have different phrase books for different areas on the arch, but that's something we can go into another time if you guys are interested. The arch is as 20 minutes of recording this podcast and this video have showed, it's a complex subject when you look at it like this, but it's once you start to implement it, it's easy, it's simple. You can start to play around with it, and that's my advice. Just see, if you're going to take action from this, I would just not even try and manipulate your self-talk, but just put a cross on an arch where you think it is, or bear the arch in mind when you're training, and that will really, really help you. I'm going to stop now because I think this is so much for you guys to take in if you haven't heard of it or heard of this concept, that it will overwhelm you. So if you enjoyed this episode, if you want to learn more about it actually, please reach out to me, because I enjoy talking about this stuff. I want to help more athletes understand the mental approach to this training. And please, if you enjoyed the podcast, leave a 5-star review on iTunes and reach out to me, all that kind of stuff. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. And definitely tell a friend if you found this useful. Resources for you for today. Just realised I haven't taken a sip of coffee in a long time. Must have been in the flow state. Resources for you today. Check out if you're listening to this on the podcast, check out the Facebook group, Mindset RX, on Facebook if you search for that. And also if you're, if you're streaming or watching, if you're streaming or listening to this, you can head to mindsetrx.com/blog/thearch, and you can find out a lot more detail about this. And you can hear it, or you can read it in a more condensed format. So if you have any questions for me, as always, shout. You can email me at tom@alphamovement.co and subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And I'll see you guys very soon for another episode of the Alpha Movement Podcast.